Good morning, everyone. We're continuing with our How to Work with People, based on Swami Kriyananda's wonderful little book, The Art of Supportive Leadership. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dear Swamiji, help us to understand the meaning of your words, not just with our minds, but with our hearts and spirits, so that we may act in our role of working with others with the wisdom and the grace that you always shared with us. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. So, this is the chapter called Leadership is Wisdom and Common Sense, and Intuition and Common Sense. And we've been spending all our time on intuition. Leadership is intuition guided by common sense. So now we're in the common sense part. Certainly, however, the safest course generally would be to rely on common sense. For it is easy to err if one relies too heavily on intuition, and difficult to err if one checks every subjective feeling against objective realities. What is common sense? Most people think of it as the voice of experience. Fools suffer, but do they learn from their suffering? A donkey repeats the same mistakes, no matter how many times his peasant beats him. For experience alone is no guarantee of wisdom. Often, indeed, people who claim to speak from experience are merely intoning a dirge of past failures. Okay, well, there's a lot that's interesting there. We can sort of work with that. It's very interesting that common sense, and we're going to explore more exactly what common sense is. When Teresa of Avila was setting up her convents, some hundreds of years ago in Spain, when she was living in the body and was reforming the Carmelite order, she started a number of small convents. They were full enclosure. I think there were 18 nuns. I thought there were a dozen, but I recently read, I think there were 18 nuns in each of her enclosed convents. And in principle, in theory, those nuns would enter that convent and that would be the rest of their lives. Of course, sometimes they got called to another convent, new postulants came in and so on, but it was a very small group and they had to work together forever. And so St. Teresa, of course, said great care must be taken in the selection of those nuns. We must be sure that they have a true vocation. And she said, above all, look for common sense. She said, all other qualities, including devotion to God, can be acquired, but if a woman lacks common sense, it's rare that she's ever able to achieve it. Now, it sort of is a bit of a draconian statement about limiting the power of grace to transform our thinking. So that isn't the aspect of it that I'm talking about. The side I'm talking about is where they were devoting themselves to God in the most uplifted way. That was the quality she thought was necessary. Now, Swamiji's definition of common sense as the voice of experience, and he'll go on to say, and the ability to learn from our experience. Common sense is not just to say, we tried it and it didn't work, which is what oftentimes people consider it to be. He calls it a dirge of past failures, just describing a litany of all the times that everything crashed down before. And so this is why Swami is putting intuition and common sense together, because one tends to think of intuition as being untethered, just it comes from a higher dimension and anything is possible. One tends to think of common sense as being, strictly tied here and now to the practical realities of this world, but Swami said they both have to go together. So it's a very interesting combination, and I think is really, in many ways, the key to success. He said, he uses this word, it is easy to err if one relies too heavily on intuition, and difficult to err if one checks every subjective feeling against objective realities. And there's the key that we're working with. When I was talking about intuition in the beginning of this section, and I was talking about the subconscious, the conscious, and the superconscious. This was a few days ago. And I didn't give the full picture of each of those levels of consciousness, just enough for the subject, but now I'm going to add something else into it. The characteristic of subconsciousness is that it is entirely subjective. I mean, the biggest example of it that we can think of, the most common example everyone can relate to, is what happens to us when we're asleep and we have dreams. I go through periods of time where I have a very vivid dream life. I don't necessarily remember it, but I wake up in the morning feeling that I've had a whole lot of adventures and experiences, even though my body and my brain were asleep and I can't quite conjure them. And sometimes the experiences are very vivid. But even if you share a bed with someone and you're both asleep, you can be having an experience in your dream in which even that person may appear to be with you. You can be traveling to foreign countries, you might be fighting off bandits, you might be in elevated states of beauty, you can be meeting dead relatives, you can be doing all sorts of things in the subconscious state. And the person who's inches away from you does not share that experience at all. You can wake up, you can tell them about it, but they weren't there. It was entirely subjective. It only took place from your perspective. However, the person who's 6 inches away from you in the bed, you both know what room you're in. You both know what city you're in. You know what you did yesterday. You know what the plans are for today. You know the names of your puppies and hopefully the names of your children and the ages of your children. There's a huge objective reality that you also share. Now, of course, there are limits. Your perception of your 6-year-old daughter and what she really needs may be different than your partner's idea of what that 6-year-old daughter actually needs. Subjective elements still come into objective reality, but there's a huge shared reality that you're in. Now, just to finish, in superconsciousness, when we transcend our awareness of our separation, then there's an absolute unity of perception, which is when you're in the state of final realization, all God-realized beings see the same divine reality, bliss, joy, so on. So there is a unity that is possible in superconsciousness that is not in the objective world and is completely absent in the subjective world. When a person enters into a state of mental imbalance, what happens to them is they lose touch with the objective world and they fall completely into a subjective world. And these days you meet people on the street who are mentally unbalanced and are unable to relate to the objective world. There was a man who was of this type. I don't know if he lived on the street or what he was like. And he came into our church one evening, and for various reasons, which I guess now that I've brought it up, I have to say, people who are too much into a subjective universe with mental imbalance are often attracted to what we're doing because they can tell that we also live in a slightly altered world, that our relationship to the objective world is not mainstream. because of our awareness of the Guru's influence in our life, because of our daily adventures in the direction of superconsciousness, because of our disinclination for many of the things that people of the world think are so important. So they will sense that our mental world is far less rigid than the average, and they know that their mental world is not as rigid as the average, and they'll think that we're a match. But the fact of the matter is, when you are trapped in a totally subjective world, you need to get grounded in the objective world before you can move to the superconscious world. And so in my 50 years of experience with Ananda, you don't have to be a great success in this world, but you can't be unhinged from objective reality in the subconscious direction. And meditation is actually not wholesome for you, because when you detach from objective reality, you go into the subconscious instead of the superconscious. So even though in the early years we tried to help those people, because they would come in and they would obviously need help, but we gradually realized that we were the last thing that they needed. So we've become very impersonal but very definite about, no, we're not really your place. We appear to be nice, we're friendly, we're sympathetic, we recognize altered states, but we're not really helpful to you. So the end of all of this is that there was this man who came in, and he was clearly one of these kinds of people, and I had to ask him to please, leave, gracefully, but please leave. And he said, well, just a minute, I have some important work to finish. And he sat on the stairs and he scribbled in some notebooks that he had with him and so on, like this. And I was telling Swamiji about the event later, and Swami said, probably he used to do important work. Probably he was, before he lost his mental balance. Perhaps he did have a job that was significant, and now he can't tell that he doesn't have that job anymore. So he finished his important work, and then he went away. It wasn't a disharmonious gathering, but he was completely detached from objective reality. There was just no way that he could do this. So what happens to us when we get into intuition, it moves us in true intuition, moves us in a superconscious direction, and objective reality is not it doesn't hold us quite so tightly. We can see something that's possible over there. In my life with Ananda, I've been an entrepreneur, been involved in starting things a lot. I remember when we were starting our school, our K through 8 school. Our high school is only 5 years old, but the K through 8 school is almost 30 years old. And when we were starting it, we were in this very interesting position where we had a master teacher who was really the impetus for our being able to do it. And so we knew we were going to be able to really offer a very good program, except, of course, when I'm talking, and I was the admissions director for a few years, so I'm talking to parents about sending their children to a school that, oh yeah, doesn't exist unless you send your children to our school. And especially we were dealing with very small children. Parents are understandably a little protective of their small children. And the idea of sending them to a school that doesn't exist, it was sort of an act of creative will on their part. Fortunately, we were persuasive, and I think we actually had 2 teachers who were both wonderful. And the teachers won the parents and won the hearts of the children also. So to get the point clearly, oh yes, we were having a meeting among some prospective parents in the living room of the house, of the apartment where we were living at the time. And I gradually began to realize what their problem was. And so I said to them, I said, I see what the difficulty is. I said, we're sitting here in the room, and you're looking at the bare spot on the carpet. We're all looking at the bare spot on the carpet. And you see a bare spot on the carpet. I see the school, because I know it's there. I know that we're just going to push through, the seeming blankness, and we're going to manifest this reality. This is what the entrepreneur spirit is like. You can see something that has not yet manifested, but you absolutely know it's there. And it was true. And we have succeeded by the grace of God. Now, it was intuition and common sense. The intuition part of it was this profound feeling from God and Guru that they would help make this happen. And the common sense part was, we had a couple of really good teachers. We weren't just thinking, oh yeah, we'll just start a school, we'll just say that we're going to start a school and we'll bring these kids in. No, we didn't start that school until we had a couple of really good teachers, because then we knew, my understanding of education, and this is a whole nother discussion, it's like if you have really good teachers who have a full picture of what's going on and really know how to work with children, which we did have, then everything else would naturally follow from that. And it has, and it did. So that's common sense and intuition playing itself out together. To have started it just because I would say, well, schools are really important to master, let's start a school. How are you going to persuade the parents? How are you going to promise them that you'll be able to deliver unless you also have some objective reality here? So this is where Swami says you can err more on ungrounded intuition, because you can make promises that you can't keep. You're just making promises based on the fact that it would be beautiful if it happened. And you're making promises on the fact that you can feel how beautiful it would be if it could happen. But we don't have enough common sense about where's the money, where's the place we're going to have the school, who's going to be the teacher. When we started that, we knew what we were risking, and it was very interesting. One of the sort of turning points was there was a gentleman a father in the discussion, and he ended up giving us two children, and they both went through our lower school, and it was extremely good for them. And he himself was a Silicon Valley self-made man, and he had created himself as an entrepreneur some very significant projects, and he started quizzing us, and all the people in charge, myself and others, we were completely honest with him. It was just the right way to be. Yes, the church is funding this. We're expecting we're going to be 25,000 in the red by the end of the year, but we think we can make that up. No, we're not certain of the final location, but yeah, this one will work. And no, of course, that's not a long-term solution, but this is the way we can start. We just told him all the truth. And he recognized us. We were kindred spirits. And immediately he decided, well, I like these people. These people are like me. This was a vision and the common sense to make it happen. And common sense may cause you to keep your aspirations too low. But intuition, without being grounded, can sink your boat. Just over and over, it can sink your boat, because you just do things you don't have the real world power to support. And so Swami says, how did he put it? For it is easy to err if one relies too heavily on intuition, and difficult to err if one checks every subjective feeling against objective realities. Subjective feeling, we really need a school. Master wants these schools. We need to start a school. Objective reality, who's going to teach? Oh, we have someone to teach. Step one, taken care of. Where can we do it? Where does the money come from? Without ever lowering the vision. And some people have a resistance to the unpleasant demands of the material world. And they feel that they sully their vision if they have to think too practically. And it's a fine line, but it's very interesting that Swami says, err on the side of common sense. And that's a lifetime of experience that causes him to do that. Swamiji was extraordinarily bold, but he was always grounded in his boldness. And if he didn't see the bare bones essentials of making something happen, he didn't just sail out in blind affirmation. He just recognized that it just wasn't going to happen. And 90% of what he saw was possible never happened because the objective world didn't support it. There was, let's see, one more piece of that. Also, the material world is really hard work. What the objective world, the material plane, it's like this is the kind of world. In the astral world, so I'm told, you can just manifest with thought. If your thought is dynamic and clear, you can manifest by the power of your thought. In this world, you have to pick up the rocks and carry them from point A to point B. I remember once, this has nothing to do with intuition. It just has to do with moving rocks. When I lived in the area that I lived in Ananda, which was Ayodhya, there was a spring, a naturally flowing spring there. And people just had lots of different ideas about how to keep that spring going. And so there was like eight women, and we were all young and we were strong. And somebody decided that we needed to fill the spring box with this fine gravel. And the spring box was like 8 by 8 and 8 feet tall. So it was like a big, I don't have a clear picture of how that whole system worked, but I do know that we had to spend a couple of long, hot days pouring gravel into that enclosure. I remember standing down in there and doing all that. Of course, for some reason, that turned out to be a terrible idea. And then we had to all go back, and we had to pull all that rock out, which was even harder than putting it in. Now, maybe memory has exaggerated that story, but that's how I remember it happening. But it was the epitome of the material plane. We just put the rocks in, then we had to put the rocks out. And a great deal of success in any project that we're going to do, every job has its boring, grinding, just effort where you're just putting out energy to reform the material plane. And maybe you get to do really congenial aspects of that, and maybe you don't. But there's always a certain point where you just have to do it. And if we're too enamored of our airy-fairy visions all the time, and we feel that, this is beneath me to do it, such people rarely achieve very much. You have to also be willing to put your hand on the plow, so to speak, and actually just push it through the hard earth. So when we're talking about the balance of intuition and common sense, pay attention. Pay attention to what is really motivating us, And there's a lot of false teaching, unfortunately, about how to manifest, which downplays common sense and upplays just imagination. And Swami's trying to get us really grounded in the real world. So he asks the question next, what is common sense? And though he says most people think of it as the voice of experience, but then Swami says, as I was reading a moment ago, fools suffer a lot. But merely to suffer is not the same as learning. And so just because we've been through something, it's not like you just, quote, pay your dues. It's like things happen and you hone your craft and you get a picture of what the consequences of your actions are, including, one of the things that we learn is when you sail out with too much ungrounded intuition and you don't have the support behind it. I was talking to a friend about, that they have lots and lots of good ideas, but you need a team to execute your ideas. Unless they're completely personal. If it's personal and you're just going to write the book, that's great. Who's going to publish it is a second question. If you're just, painting a picture or designing a house or something, but at a certain point, other people have to get involved. And you can have all the great ideas in the world, but if no one wants to help you, if you don't have that aspect also developed where you can inspire other people with your vision. This was, of course, Swami Kriyananda's extraordinary genius. I remember being in his house one evening, And it was like late at night. It was like 10 or 11 in the evening. And there were, I believe there were 10 people in his house at that time, each one of whom was hard at work at some project that Swamiji had more or less created, and I'm going to say created for them, including me. I was there, I don't know, remember what I was doing, but we were all working, and we were all working on creative vision that began with him. But he also knew how to draw the energy together, and we were all happy as could be being in that house doing that. I remember it because it was such a vividly fun night, because there was so much going on all over the place, and everybody was having such a good time doing what they were doing. Probably it would involve the recording studio. Maybe there were some repairs going on. I might have been working with a manuscript. Perhaps there was even cooking, maybe cleaning. I really can't even remember when I go like this. But he had also the ability to inspire people to want to work with him. That's the practical, objective side of it. In order to manifest this, more energy than I personally have is going to be required. Now, we can try to start projects without having enough people to help us, or the right people to help us, and have it not work. And then we can refuse to learn from that. And we can just keep going, and then until we feel bitterly disappointed because people are no damn good and nobody wants to help with a noble project, or we can learn from it. So the point is not merely to have experiences, what we lovingly always called learning experiences. That was the Ananda code for, oh, it was a disaster. When somebody would go on an adventure, I mean, we were so primitive in the way we did everything. It was so marvelous. You know, our country people would put on our concept of city clothes and go out and try to sell our products or make some connections that we might need. And, you know, how did it go? Oh, it was a learning experience. But that was actually a very important phrase. If it really was a learning experience, I realized that, what? That nobody's interested in the product I have, that it has to be modified in order to work, that I need to make better contacts before I just walk in, you know, that this city, there's too much competition in that geographic area. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can learn. And if you actually learn them, then either you continue to express your beautiful intuitive idea, but now we're using, and the word Swami uses for it is a little more common sense. It's not sufficient just to make this wonderful thing. We also have to think about how it's going to be used. I remember we had this, we were at the very beginning of a lot of things that have become mainstream now. And one of the products we had in the early 70s was essentially health food candy or health food bars. Now it's just, there's millions of them. But at that time it didn't exist. We made a carob bar, and we made a bar out of ground dates and coconut. We called the date one an Om bar, which was a private joke because an Om bar was also something you used when you meditated. And then the carob one, we called it Deva Delights, the angels delight in it. And they were good products, and they worked well. And then we had this, we got invited or got a place at one of the a big Renaissance fair in Marin County, which was a huge gig. But we grossly overestimated how many Om bars and how many Deva Delights the attendees at that event would eat. We sold a lot, but we also didn't even know how long our product would last. So because we vastly overestimated the quantity, we started creating too soon, and by the time we got there, some of it was past its prime date, et cetera, et cetera. But we learned. And subsequently, whenever anything like that came again, we moved in a realistic manner. But if we had just affirmed the next time that it was going to be, you know, this wild success on a scale that the world did not support, then we would have been like the fools and the donkeys. So common sense is not just experience, but the ability to learn and adjust to what we have come to know. So more tomorrow, my friends. God bless you.